Today's daf is daf Vav, and we'll start with Lav de Mechamer. And that's where more or less we finished up yesterday. We're talking about a case where a father on Shabbos commands his son to be manhig a behema, to lead a beast of burden with a burden on it. And that's a violation of a lav. The Torah says, Lo tasik hamalacha uvehemtecha, and behemtecha is coming to teach us a lav. And Isurei Shabbos fall into two categories. One is the 39 malachas, which generate a chiyuv kares, a chiyuv skila b'mezid, and if there are Edom and Asra, and then there's a chiyuv for violating a lav. And in the case of Mechamer, it's not a malacha, but it's a lav. And on this, we need a pasuk to teach us that the essay of Kibbud Av does not override the lav of Mechamer. As far as a lav sheyesh bo kares, in the case where the father said masheli, when the father commands him to violate a malacha d'orais, that's a different story. That doesn't really need a pasuk, because we would never even entertain the idea that the mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em as an essay would override a lav sheyesh bo kares. So now we're back to our original question: why did the Torah have to add the word aleha in the parasha of Yibum as a mute to be mamayit the case where Yibum overlaps, or shall we say confronts, a lav sheyesh bo kares? And the Gemara says afilu hachi lo dachi. The Gemara now asks the following question: if Kibbud Av Va'em cannot override the lav of Mechamer, even though Mechamer doesn't have kares, nevertheless, Kibbud Av Va'em is not powerful enough to be docha. Ela de kaimelon, we paskin that essay docha losaseh. If it's a regular losaseh, certainly an essay would override a losaseh, like the case of Kilayim B'tzitzis. Ligmarei hacha. Why don't we derive the conclusion from Kibbud Av Va'em that doesn't override the lav Mechamer on Shabbos, the lo lidchi? Then in general, in Kol HaTorah Kula, as universal rule, an essay cannot be docha losaseh. In this case of Mechamer on Shabbos for Kibbud Av Va'em would become now the paradigmic case of ein essay docha losaseh. V'chi tema shiny lavi de Shabbos l'chamiri. Maybe as a general rule, an essay would override a losaseh, but not the losaseh of Shabbos, even though it's only Mechamer. But even Mechamer is indicative of Kedusha Shabbos, meaning if one violates the Iser of Mechamer, he is a Mechal Shabbos. And although he's a Mechal Shabbos on a lower level, but when we talk about Shabbos in general, a Mechal Shabbos is considered as if he was Oved Avodah Zarah. This is a Kedusha Chamura that's being desecrated. And that's why a lav is a lav of Shabbos, even though it's only a lav, and it's the case of Mechamer, could not be overridden by an essay of Kibbud Av. But as far as other lavim is concerned, where there's no chilul of Shabbos, which is ki'ilu oved avodah zarah, if it's not so chomer, then eino chinami, an essay would be docha losaseh. The Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says, "But Tana bi'almakoi." We find the Tana in other places that derives from the fact that the Torah was memayit the overriding of Shabbos for Kibbud Av, that even with regard to other Isurim, we're not going to be docha the other Isurim for the sake of Kibbud Av Va'em. And how can you derive from the fact that Kibbud Av Va'em could not override Shabbos, that therefore it cannot override other Isurim? I mean, you're talking about Shabbos, which is a lav d'chomer. For local park, nobody ever objected to that Tana by saying, wait a second, how can you tell me such a thing? We're talking about Shani Lav de Shabbos de Chamiri. That doesn't even appear. Apparently, we don't say Shani Lav de Shabbos de Chamir, but we judge Shabbos by the same yardstick, and we weigh it in the same way we would weigh other Lav. If his father, who is a Kohen, tells his son, who's also a Kohen, Hitame, go into a cemetery. And the pasuk says, "Emor la kohanim lenefesh lo yitamo b'amav," and the father says, "Go into a cemetery because I lost something. I left something in the cemetery, and that would be kibbud av to return the aveda." Oh, alternatively, Omalo, the father said, "For the sake of my kibbud, al tachzir, I want you to be involved in cooking for me, and grill me a good steak, a good barbecue, v'al tachzir, and then leave the aveda out. Be misalim and look the other way." The Torah says, "Vashivosa lo suchalis alim is yochel yishmalo." I might think that he should listen to his father's command, and he should violate these lavim for the sake of kibbud av. Talmud Lomar, each imo v'aviv tiro v'echshav susai tishmor ani Hashem kulchem chayovim b'chvodi. The Torah puts in one pasuk the mitzvah of Yira vis-a-vis one's parents, and the mitzvah of Shmirat Shabbos, in order to teach us that we're all chayav in the covet of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We cannot violate a malach of Shabbos for the sake of kibbud av. And therefore, I have a right to extrapolate from this that a lav of tumas mes, for example, and again, we're talking about a Kohen who would, for the sake of kibbud av ha'em, theoretically violate tumas mes, or halama me'aveda, looking the other way with regard to an aveda. These lavim of tuma in the case of a Kohen, and halamas ayin in the case of anyone who lost an aveda, these are not trumped by the essay of kibbud av. And therefore, we are not going to make a distinction between isurish lavim on Shabbos, like Machamet, but rather all lavim are uniform, are equal in their chumrah, the darga, the level of chumrah, of severity. And therefore, we cannot interpret the pasuk in terms of lav to mechaber, because if you're going to say that, then we should derive from the lav mechaber that kol tarkul universally, and essay is not dochalosase. And therefore, we have no choice but to assume that Meleches Shabbos, which has kares, is in a special category on its own. So Shuv yesh lomod mimenu shedafka kibbud av ein adocha lav shel sham shel sheyesh bo kares, aval shar esim shebatorah dochem afilu lav sheyesh bo kares. For example, Yibum in our case. And this is a very good answer to the question why we need a leah in the Parsha Vachos Ishto with regard to Yibum. The Gemara objects. Ella, if you're going to tell me that in the Brisa we're talking about a case where his father commanded him to violate a malach on Shabbos, I don't understand why there was a need to write a leah as an extra word regarding Yibum of Achos Ishto, Mishum Digel and Mifrach. We could put a pircha and object to this derivation from the mitzvah kibbud av ha'em, where the Torah said that it does not override a lotas hashish bo kares, implying that in other dinei Torah an essay would be dochel lotas hashish bo kares. Malahanoch. What do you have in the case of Melechet Shchita, Bichel v'Shabbos, that would be overridden by kibbud av? Shekein hechsher mitzvah. When we violate these lavim of tumas mes or lo suchalis alem, we're in a category called hechsher mitzvah. Okay, now we have Rashi Shita and then the Shem Tosas Shita. Rashi Shita is at hechsher mitzvah of kibbud av, meaning that there's no possibility of being Makayim the mitzvah of kibbud av in any other way unless overriding the law. And therefore there was room, logically, to assume that the essay would be docha lotase. And therefore the Torah was compelled to set up a mute to teach me Eino Docha. But Yibum, where the Averis Halav is Hechshera Yochid Shala Essay, right? There are other alternatives. The Averis Halav can be circumvented. There's no need for Yibum because he can give a chalitza without violating the Isur Kares of Achos Isha. So therefore, even without Olel, we could not have come to the logical conclusion that he should be V'yamei Machos Ishto. Ella, if you're asking what would have been in the absence of the word Oleha, Salkit, I would have thought, Teisei mi binyan beis hamikdash. Let's derive that an essay of Yibum could be Docha, the Yisakaris of Achos Isha, for the case of Binyan Beis HaMikdash. That, again, is a mute to teach you that we don't build the Mikdash on Shabbos. The Sanya Yochel Yehi Binyan Beis HaMikdash Docha Shabbos. I would have thought that the Chiv mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash would apply even on Shabbos. It's a mitzvah say, and it should be Docha Lo Saseh. Talmud Lomar Shab Sosei Tishmoru Umikdashi Tiro. We derive from the pasuk in Vayikra Parshas Kedoshim that you and the Mikdash are all obligated in the honor and the glory of God. So Shmir Shabbos is for the honor of God, the Kavod HaShechina, and that's beyond other mitzvahs. And that's what we testify regarding the Ribbon Shalom, who created the world, and the Mechalos of Shabbos like a kofer b'maisa bracious. Is my love b'bonav is sosev a time at the kosev achman hashab sosev tichmar lav hachi dachi. We're talking about a person who's building the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos, and he's bona, and he's sosev. These are malachas of chiyuv kares on Shabbos, and the reason why they are prohibited is because the Torah says, if not for that extra pasuk, logically we would have said that even with regard to this essay, we can override the lotas, even if it's a lav sheish bo karetz. And of course, that's going to have the impact on Yibum in the case of an Achos Isha, a case of an Erva, etc. So the Gemara rejects it and says, "Lo, lav de mechaber." The pasuk is not coming to exclude a person who wants to be osek and set up the binyan Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos by building it and destroying it and building it again. These are malachos that you chayev aleim karetz. So the pasuk cannot be coming to exclude this kind of involvement in binyan Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos, with again the malach of biniyah or stira, because that would engender a chiyuv karetz. And therefore we have to assume that the pasuk is coming to exclude lav de mechamer. And what does that mean, lav de mechaber? It means that we're talking about a case of mechamer litzorach binyan Beis Hamikdash b'Shabbos. Now, as we need to move the supplies, the stones for construction, and the transportation of those building materials is achieved by using a beast of burden who's transporting them, and this is the lav of the mechamer. But that's a malav that only has malchus. There's no chiyuv kares. But in the case of malach sheish bar kares, like, for example, binyan ustira mamish, in those cases, the Torah is not coming to exclude it on Shabbos because we know that it's not possible. We're going to assume that the essay of building Beis Hamikdash would not override the Shabbos. And that would be a simple assumption. Just to review the last point, when the Gemara says lav de mechamer, It means that we're talking about a malacha she'ein ba kares, and the pasuk doesn't need a mute to exclude the case of a full-fledged malacha of Shabbos, which generates a chiyuv kares. That for sure, it was beyond question that it would not override, an essay would not override a lav sheish bo kares in the case of malacha gemura. And therefore, we no longer have a proof from the exclusion of Shabbos that the Havamina was that you would override the Shabbos, because we're not talking about anything other than a lav de mechamer. So the Gemara now raises the following question on that rejection. If binyan beis hamikdash is not docha a lav, and it means a lav mechamer, va'afilu hachilo dochi is el d'kaimelon d'esei osi esi docha osi say yesh lanu ligmar mehacha lo dochi, which should derive from binyan beis hamikdash, which does not override a lav di alma of Shabbos, of transporting the building materials through a violation of the lav mechamer on Shabbos, that an essay would not be docha losasa. Even if it's a regular classic losasa, an essay doesn't have the power to override and trump a losasa. And we're going to come to a conclusion that ein essay docha losasa. We have no choice. We know that essay docha losasa. We have to therefore assume that our case here is not a case of mechamer, which is a lav di alma, but rather it's a case of the lav of Melecha Shabbos, of the lav sheish bo kares. And once again, we're going to derive here that in the case of Yibum, the essay of Yibum would trump the Isur Erva and Isur Kares of Achos Isha. Therefore, we need a leah. And if you'll try to tell me that maybe Shabbos is more chamur, and because the lav of Shabbos are more chamurim, therefore the Machal Shabbos, who's equivalent to an Oved Avodah Zarah, that puts it into a separate category, and an essay cannot be docha. But other lavim, like for example kalayim, would be trumped by a mitzvah say, like for example tzitzis. And if that be the case, we have no havamid in the case of yibum, for which we need a leah, because we're talking about a case of lave de Shabbos de chamiri. Because Machal Shabbos is an Oved Avodah Zarah. That's why it might be different in that case, and therefore it's not overridden by an essay. But other lavim, which are regular classic lavim, would be nidchem, would be overridden by an essay, like we found in Kalayim Tzitzis. Gemara says, no, that's not a possibility. Tana bi almakoi. We have a Tana elsewhere. Bialma means a different Tana that derives from a mute in the Torah, the exclusion of the Chiyah Shabbos in the case of Kibbutz Av. And therefore, we should derive the conclusion that other Isurim likewise would not be Nidchim by Kibbutz Av, because the very fact that we needed a mute would probably set up some sort of a binyan Av that Isurim einom nidachim, but it might be only because of Kibbutz Av, we'll see. Veloka parach, and the Gemara does not raise the following objection to that Tana by saying Shani lavi de Shabbos de Chamiri. We see that we're not machalik between the Isur Shabbos and other Isurim in the Torah. The Sanya we have in a brayso, Yochel Omelo Ovid. His father says to his son is a Kohen. Hitame, go into the Beis HaKvaros, lahoshiv liavedos. Osha omelo aviv is asek bekvod al tachzirus aveda. Is ale mimena. Don't get involved in picking up the aveda. That's too time consuming. I need you now to service me. And in that sense, the son is going to violate the lavel of suchal esam yochel lishma. I might think that I should obey my father. And if I'm a Kohen, I'll violate the Isur Beis HaKvaros and return his Aveda. And if I'm a Yisrael, I will violate the Isur Lavel Suchal L'Salim for the sake of Kibbutz Av. Talmud Lomer each imo v'aviv tirov v'shabsosei tishmani Hashem kulchem chayovim b'chvodi. We don't violate the lav of Shabbos for the sake of Kibbutz Av. And if I bring a lav, for example, of tumas mes or lo suchalis alim and aveda, and they should not be subject to dechia for the sake of the essay of kibbud av. So we learn from this that you cannot use this dechia and say shani Shabbos, lavi the Shabbos the chamiri. That the lavim of Shabbos are different because they're chamiri, but rather all lavim of the Torah are treated equally in a uniform way. And from the fact that the lav of Mechamer does not override Shabbos, in the case of Binyan Beis Hamikdash, when he violates the lav of Mechamer to transport the building materials, we should therefore derive from this that no lav would be docha, or would be nidcha, I should say, would be subject to the chiyah for any essay. We have to therefore conclude that the pasuk is talking about a malacha sheish ba karetz, and such a malacha is not nidcha. And let's derive from this that in other mitzvahs where we don't have this miyut, even if it's a lav sheish ba karetz, the essay would override the lav. And that's the case of Yibum of Achos Isha. So now the Gemara tries a different approach to be docha. Why is it impossible to learn from Binyan Beis Hamikdash? Now, according to Rashi, Echad Mitzvah means there's no way of building the Migdash without putting one stone on top of the other within a structure and creating a binyan. And that's not like the case of Yibum, where he has another option, alternative of Chalitza. According to Tosas Shita, the Hechsher Mitzvah means that at this moment in time, he's not being Mekayim the Mitzvah. And if we're talking about Soser Ubona, that is the Mitzvah Binyan. But perhaps we could say that the Mitzvah Binyan is only completed, it's only fulfilled at the completion. So every single stone is considered a partial Kiyum mitzvah. It's a hechshet to set up the mitzvah. So again, why do we need the Oleh? Even without Oleh, we would never say that the Isur Lav of Achos Isha could be Nidcha because of the essay of Yibum. We're only talking about Hechsher Mitzvah here. In the case of Yibum, it's not Hechsher Mitzvah, either according to Rashi because he has the alternative method of Chalitza, or according to Tosas Shita, it's considered a Hechsher Mitzvah because this is only a preparatory stage, a preliminary stage to achieve the final Kiyum Mitzvah. So the Gemara now doesn't understand this dechia, this rejection. The Gemara says, Hechsher mitzvah, tepuk mehasam. You're telling me that Hechsher mitzvah is not docha losaseh, in the case of losaseh sheish bo kares? Let's derive from the mitzvah kibbud av, which is not docha Shabbos, that even if it's a Hechsher mitzvah, it's not docha Shabbos. And therefore, you want to derive a conclusion that when it's not Hechsher mitzvah, then it would be docha. Tepuk miyasa. Well, in the case of kibbud av, and it doesn't override the Shabbos, even though it's a Hechsher mitzvah, or because it's a Hechsher mitzvah. But if the pasuk had not come along and said u'mikdashai tiro, just to teach me that Hechsher mitzvah is docha losaseh, even though it has kares. We don't need another layafutz, another limit. That's sufficient. But just that we already derived from this that kibbud av and Shabbos, shahoisa Shabbos nidches befanov lulei amir amur, we would have forced the Shabbos to step aside for the sake of a mitzvah like kibbud av, if not for the rejection, the mir of the pasuk, is therefore we prove the hechrek. We have no choice that the Torah, when it says umikdashai tiro, is coming to teach me that even in a case where the Dechiyas Halav is not a Lav Sheish Bo Kares, and the Hechsher Mitzvah is Kigona Yibum Be'achos Isha, where you could give a Chalitza, so that's not a Hechsher Mitzvah. Nevertheless, Min HaRoi She'idocha Isa B'Shvil Esek. Ve'al Af She'hayibum Eino Hechsher Mitzvah, Yesh Lo Lidchos Afilu Lav She'esh Bo Kares, even without Hechsher Mitzvah. And therefore, we understand why the Torah had to go out of its way to exclude Achos Isha and Yevamot from Olel. Because if not for Olel, we would conclude that in the case where there's a Hechsher Mitzvah, or I should say there's no Hechsher Mitzvah in the case of Yibum, to avoid the violation of the Lav, we would say that there should be a dechiyah of a lav, even though it's a lav sheish bo kares, in the case of achos isha. And now it makes sense why the Torah had to be mamayid achos isha from Yibum in the pasuk deriving from the pasuk olel. So even if we're talking about overriding a lav sheish bo kares, if it's a situation like Yibum of Achos Isha, we would derive the conclusion that Yesh Lo Lidchos Afilu Lav Sheish Bo Kares. So at this point, the Gemara rejects the derivation from Binyan Beis Hamikdash. In Achinami, you're right, we don't need a pasuk to prohibit Binyan Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. We already learned the Chiddush of this exact sort from Kibud Aim, that's not Docha the Shabbos, even though it's a Hechsher Mitzvah. Ken Rashi Shi. So therefore, this pasuk is not coming to teach me Shelo Yidoche Binyan Beis Hamikdash Shabbos. And the pasuk reads, V'yashab Sosai Tishmoru Mikdashai Tiro Lomali Miboilei L'chidesanya. The reason why the Torah commanded the Shabbos is because of the Brisa, the principle of the Brisa. Yochel Yisrael Odom B'Mikdash. Person might be afraid, or somebody might be afraid that they'll make the Beis HaMikdash into a lohus, some sort of divine being with powers to it. Amalomesh Avsotzai Tishmoru Ves Mikdashai Tiro. Nemra Shmira B'Shabbos. V'Nemra Mora b'migdash, and therefore hukshu zelazeh, and that's going to teach us ma shmira amura lo b'Shabbos hatamas yoreh, lo mishabbos hatamas yoreh, ella she hizhir al Shabbos. So we're now on daf vav amid beis on the top of the